Here we have two watchtowers. One is on the hill with the dead tree, protecting the only access to our town. It's garrisoned with 4 villagers and has fletching researched. The other tower is at the bottom of the hill, and while it also has 4 villagers garrisoned, it doesn't have fletching. Which of these towers do you think will win the fight? The one with the attack upgrade and the hill bonus should win, right? Let's just delete this outpost over here to make them attack and... What just happened? How in the crazy Age of Empires 2 logic did the downhill tower manage to win this fight? Well, there's a few different mechanics at play here, and to make matters worse, the Definitive Edition's July 2021 patch also makes some slight adjustments to how garrison arrows work. So sit back, get your popcorn and your boar meat, and get ready to learn every last detail we ever wanted to know about how buildings fire arrows when they're garrisoned. First, we need an overview of the unit attributes that govern projectile behavior. In the Advanced Genie Editor, we have a list of all units in the game. This list includes units such as archers and villagers, buildings such as castles, towers, and town centers, and even projectiles such as arrows, cannonballs, and fire. That's right, projectiles are modeled as units in the game's logic. Every unit has a list of attack classes and armor classes, controlling their damages, defenses, and various bonuses. Units also have a reload time, which is the time they need to wait after attacking before they can attack again. Units can have 2 projectiles, a primary projectile, and a secondary projectile. Most units, like archers, have just a primary projectile, but other units, such as Chu Ko Nus and mangonels, have secondary projectiles. The total projectiles field controls the number of projectiles, one of which is primary, and the rest of which are secondary. A mangonel has a value of 6 in this field, thus it fires 1 primary projectile and 5 secondary projectiles. There's another field for the max total projectiles. This field determines the maximum number of arrows a building can fire when other units are garrisoned inside of it. For example, a castle has values of 5 total projectiles and 21 max total projectiles. It can be garrisoned to fire up to 1 primary projectile and 20 secondary projectiles. The number of projectiles is represented in parentheses next to the building's pierce attack in the interface. And finally, each unit has a garrison capacity, which is the number of units that may garrison inside of it. Note that this value is independent from the max total projectiles. Sometimes we can over-garrison to the point where adding more units stops adding more projectiles, or we can under-garrison, where a fully garrisoned building still doesn't have enough extra arrows to hit its maximum. Since the projectiles themselves are represented as units, they have their own statistics. Here's where the key differences between primary and secondary projectiles occur. The statistics of the primary projectile do not matter. The damage dealt by this projectile is controlled entirely by the statistics of the unit that shoots it. Many primary projectiles, such as this archer arrow here, don't even have any attack classes since they wouldn't contribute to the damage calculation. But the stats do matter for the secondary projectile. For an example, let's look at Kipchaks against battering rams. The Kipchak himself doesn't have any melee attack, and his pierce attack is cancelled out completely by the battering ram's armor. Hence, the primary projectile deals only 1 damage. But Kipchaks use Chu Ko Nu projectiles as their secondary arrows. These arrows have 0 melee damage, and since rams have -3 melee armor, the extra arrows end up dealing 3 damage each. So Kipchaks gain their ability to fight rams effectively, not from their own attacks, but from the attacks of their extra arrows. Now there are units with ranged attacks that don't have projectiles. The Kamayuks and Step Lancers are the 2 main examples in real games, being able to attack from 1 tile away. But for a more extreme demonstration, let's increase the range of this champion here. We'll see he magically deals damage several tiles away as he stands still and swings his sword in the air. Next, let's give that champion a primary projectile. Let's have him shoot fire from his sword. Now, the damage doesn't get inflicted until the fire hits. Also, even though his total projectiles field is set to 0, there is a minimum of 1 projectile that always is shot when the primary projectile field has an actual unit assigned to it. Next, what if we gave him multiple total missiles but no secondary projectile? Then the primary projectile is used as the secondary projectile. he continues shooting even more fire from his sword. The main example of a unit in a real game that is set up like this is the Bombard Tower, which doesn't have a secondary projectile, but still can fire multiple cannonballs in some situations. But we'll get back to this tower later. For now, let's give the champion a Bombard Tower shot as a secondary projectile, just to show off that these can be different from the primary projectile. There he goes, shooting fire and tossing rocks. Note also that even if the total projectiles value is greater than the max total projectiles, then he still isn't able to exceed the value capped by the maximum field, with the only exception being the minimum of one projectile that always is shot. At this point, we might be wondering whether there is any unit with a secondary projectile but no primary projectile. Yes, the town center. It has a value of 1 for its total projectiles, but when ungarrisoned, nothing is fired because it doesn't have a primary projectile. The value of 11 for max total projectiles then allows the TC to shoot up to 10 secondary arrows. Remember that the interface at the bottom shows only the secondary arrows, so these 10 arrows are what show up in the parentheses. And one more note about the secondary projectiles, sometimes a unit fires all of its secondary projectiles at once, such as the Mangonel or Mayan skirmishers with their new unique technology. Other units fire their projectiles staggered one after another, such as the Chu Ko Nus and castles. The rate at which these staggered projectiles are fired can be controlled using the unit's frame delay, with larger delays leading to more time between attacks in a single volley. As we add more arrows, the time it takes to shoot one complete volley increases, and the reload timer starts counting only when all of the arrows have been loosed. If we garrison a castle to its full 21 arrows, then we can see that it fires fewer volleys over time, but in general it's still a good thing to increase the number of arrows per volley, as typically this has a much greater effect upon the building's damage output. Now that we know what secondary projectiles are, let's get to the meat of the issue. How does the game determine the number of arrows that buildings shoot when units are garrisoned inside? Zach made a video about this topic a few years ago, but we want to be careful because the formula he gave is slightly wrong, and there's a few things he didn't account for. And the definitive edition also has now changed the calculation slightly. For starters, buildings take their total projectiles and add to that a number of additional projectiles. This sum is then capped by the building's max total projectile value, and the floor is taken to round down to the nearest integer. If this value is too low, then a minimum of 1 projectile is used. So how is the value for additional projectiles calculated? First, we need to consider each unit garrisoned in the building. We take their pierce attack and add to that 4/5 of their secondary projectile's pierce attack, multiplied by the number of secondary projectiles they shoot. This value is divided by the unit's reload time. Using 4/5 of each secondary attack is the change made in the Definitive Edition's July patch. In the past, if a garrisoned unit had a secondary projectile, then only the attack of one of these projectiles was used. This is why the Chu Ko Nus was so bad at adding extra projectiles to buildings. Next, blacksmith upgrades, chemistry, thumb ring, and various other bonuses are accounted for in these calculations. The blacksmith upgrades and chemistry each add 1 pierce attack, and thumb ring individually affects a variety of units, multiplying their reload time by 0.8, 0.85, or 0.9, thereby making them fire faster. Now these values are summed together for all units garrisoned in a building. This sum is then scaled so that it's harder to add arrows to buildings with more attack. The sum is multiplied by the reload speed of the building divided by the building's pierce attack. The secondary arrows for the building are not used, just the building's primary attack. This calculation is roughly the sum of the garrisoned unit damage per second divided by the building's damage per second. That explains the basic situation, so let's look at a few examples. An ungarrisoned castle fires 5 arrows, 1 primary and 4 secondary, because it has 5 total projectiles. Let's garrison 20 archers. Each archer has a pierce attack of 4 and a reload time of 2. The castle has a pierce attack of 11 and a reload time of 2. The reload times cancel out, so we have a fraction with the archer attack on top and the castle attack on the bottom. Each archer adds 4/11ths of an arrow, or approximately 0.36 arrows. Now let's do some blacksmith upgrades. Fletching adds 1 attack to the archers and to the castle. Adding +1 to the numerator and to the denominator of our fraction brings it closer to 1, which is an increase since it was less than 1 to begin with. Hence the upgrade makes the castle fire more arrows. and continuing to research the blacksmith upgrades increases the number of arrows that are fired. We also can research chemistry for an additional +1 attack, and, more importantly, fire arrows. The final upgrade we need is Thumb Ring, which multiplies the reload time of the archers by 0.85. It does not affect the DPS of the castle, so overall it increases the number of arrows shot. Next, let's look at some elite Chu Ko Nus. These units fire 5 projectiles, 1 primary and 4 secondary. Each of these secondary projectiles contributes 4/5 of its pierce attack to the castle's number of arrows, in addition to the Chu Ko Nus contributing its primary pierce attack. In the original game, each elite Chu Ko Nu would contribute only its secondary attack and use this value only once. This change is a buff for the Chinese, as the Chu Ko Nu goes from being one of the worst units at adding extra arrows to being one of the best. Now let's look at some hand Cannoneers, where we'll get a very different example. These units are not affected by the blacksmith attack upgrades. We'll start with chemistry researched, since that's a prerequisite for hand cannons. These hand Cannoneers have 17 pierce attack and a reload speed of 3.45. Combining this with a castle that has +1 attack from chemistry, we see that each garrisoned hand Cannoneer adds approximately 0.82 arrows. But as we research the blacksmith upgrades, they affect only the castle and not the hand cannons. As we increase the castle's attack, we add to the bottom of the fraction and end up decreasing the number of arrows added by the hand Cannoneers. Without any blacksmith upgrades, 10 garrisoned hand cannons add 8 arrows, but with all of the blacksmith upgrades, they add only 6 arrows. So here's our first situation where researching upgrades makes the garrisoned units add fewer arrows. There are a few weird examples here. Villagers can garrison in buildings, so how is their attack calculated? They always have a fixed DPS of 2.5. Even when researching fletching, supremacy, or the Inca blacksmith upgrades, this value never changes. Now we can start getting back to our original example. Both of these towers are garrisoned with 4 villagers, but if we look closely, we can see that the tower at the top of the hill fires 1 less arrow. That's because when we research fletching, we increase the attack of the tower, but the villagers maintain their same DPS value. Instead of rounding down to 5 arrows, we now have a value that rounds down to 4 arrows. We would need to bring over and garrison a 5th villager, and then waste more idle time with an extra vill in the tower in order to fire the full 5 arrows with fletching. Now that's still not the entire story behind why the tower on the hill is weaker, but let's finish discussing this damage formula first. The Teutons have a unique technology, Crenellations, that allows their garrisoned infantry to fire arrows. These infantry use the same fixed DPS value of 2.5, so Teutonic Knights add the same number of arrows as do villagers. But there's a few questions here. What happens if allied infantry units garrison within our castles? It turns out they don't actually add any arrows. Instead, if we garrison our own infantry inside of allied castles, then they add extra arrows. It's a bit unintuitive that this bonus is tied to the infantry instead of the castles, since the term Crenellations refers to the architecture of the walls, but maybe the Teutonic Knights are just so buff that they carry stones around with them to put on allied walls, then carry them away when they leave. If we happen to convert throwing axemen or Gebeto warriors and garrison them, then they also count as infantry, so they'll add additional arrows as well. But even though Mamelukes do melee damage, they're still on a camel, so they don't count as infantry. Let's also note that organ guns and ballista elephants, even though we can garrison them inside of castles as we create them, don't actually add any extra arrows. The game simply avoids using them in this projectile calculation. Now there is one more exception, and that is the Krepost. This building is locked to the same number of arrows as is a castle. Normally the Krepost would shoot more arrows since it has a lower attack of 9 instead of 11, but the game makes a special exception to the general rule for this building. And for completeness, Donjons have the same attack and reload speed as regular towers. The only difference is that they gain +1 to their total projectile and max total projectile values in the Castle Age and again in the Imperial Age. So in the Feudal Age, even though they have more garrison space, they aren't able to fire any more extra arrows than standard towers. Now let's wrap up this section by discussing Bombard Towers. We can get Teuton Bombard Towers to fire up to 4 cannonballs. In the original game, the most we could get is 3 by having a Turk ally garrison elite Janissaries. But now, with the change affecting Chu Ko Nus, a Chinese ally can help us shoot 4 cannonballs at once. These Bombard Towers are a bit weird though, since they have values of 0 for both total projectiles and max total projectiles. They fire the minimum of 1 cannonball, but why do they ever fire more than 1? Even if we take another civilization and increase that tower's garrison capacity, we still get only 1 cannonball. The answer lies in the Teuton's bonus of twice the garrison capacity for towers. This bonus is implemented by adding 5 garrison space and 4 max total projectiles for every unit that has the tower class. This bonus affects Bombard Towers, increasing their maximum total projectiles from 0 to 4. It doesn't seem like this bonus ever was intended, since Bombard Towers don't even have a secondary projectile, but sometimes these unintended consequences end up being quite fun, especially if we increase the number of projectiles to even more than 4. Next, we'll move on and discuss hill bonuses. Now that we know why the downhill tower fires 1 extra arrow, we still have another question. Why is this arrow so powerful that it overcomes both the extra attack from fletching and the hill bonus that the other tower has? Let's look at the damage calculations for the tower projectiles. For the primary projectile, we take every attack class for the tower and subtract the corresponding armor class from the tower that it's attacking. Fletching increases the tower's pierce attack by 1, so we apply that bonus to the pierce class. If the defending tower doesn't have a corresponding armor class, then the base armor value of 1000 is used. The base armor lets the tower ignore bonus attacks for unrelated units such as spearmen, fishing ships, and camel ships. Now, if any of these differences are negative, they're set to 0, then they're summed together for the exciting sum of 0. The primary projectile, even with the +1 attack of fletching, still isn't enough to overcome the tower's pierce armor. So now when we go to apply the hill bonus, we multiply 0 by 1.25 and still get 0. The game has a minimum damage of 1 that is dealt by all attacks, so the primary projectile only does 1 damage. If we put 2 towers next to each other by themselves and have them stand there shooting, then they'll just keep doing 1 damage over and over and over. The real damage dealt in tower fights comes from the secondary projectiles, so let's take a look at them. Here the main difference is the secondary projectile's attack versus stone defenses. The tower has 0 armor in this class, so we get a total of 5 damage. But we don't multiply this value by 1.25 for the hill bonus. We know that secondary projectiles already use their own stats instead of the stats from the unit shooting them. But the secondary projectiles also ignore this unit's elevation difference. We never apply a hill bonus to them, regardless of whether the tower is on a hill or in a valley. So in total, that's 1 damage from the primary projectile and 5 damage from each secondary projectile. Researching fletching isn't enough to overcome the tower's armor, being on a hill doesn't give any attack advantage, and losing 1 arrow after researching fletching means the tower now does 5 less damage per volley of arrows. A bunch of different mechanics all interact to yield this unintuitive outcome. Phew, so that's nice. But wait, what about Bombard Towers? Its projectiles are all primary, since its secondary slot is set to none, so when it fires multiple cannonballs, they all benefit from the hill bonus. Each of the 4 shots does 120 pierce damage, which increases to 150 from the hill. That's a potential of 600 damage if all 4 shots hit the same target. Oh, and one more item to note is the 20% damage increase dealt to buildings constructed on the cracked dirt terrains. Secondary arrows do still get their 20% bonus multiplied to these buildings, even though they don't get the hill bonus. Now let's look at some other in-game examples where garrison arrows matter. Let's start with town centers shooting at boars. Without fletching, garrisoning 1 villager makes the TC shoot 1 arrow. If we're shooting a boar with the TC, then we cannot garrison the villager that's being chased. The one arrow that gets shot can be enough to kill the boar and spoil any of its food. However, once we research fletching, one villager no longer is enough to make the TC shoot. We need to garrison 2 villagers in order to shoot 1 arrow. Alas, if only we could wait until fletching, it would be much easier to avoid accidentally shooting 1 arrow and killing the boar with the TC. As the game progresses, it's still worth it to research the attack upgrades for the TC to overcome the armor of enemy raiding units such as knights, but it does mean we fire fewer arrows, so it might be easier for a small group of feudal scouts to dodge the TC fire. And this also matters when being douched. Town center arrows do 5 damage to enemy town centers. Even though the TC has a garrison capacity of 15, it shoots a maximum of 10 arrows. Without fletching, it takes 10 villagers to shoot 10 arrows, and adding more villagers is a waste because they're essentially idle. Fletching does increase the arrow damage against TCs, going from 5 to 6 damage, but that comes at a cost, as with fletching, we now need 13 villagers in order to shoot the full 10 arrows. Considering how much wood it takes to repair a TC, that's a lot of extra idle time if we get engaged in a TC fight, even if the maximum damage output is increased. It is worth it, though, to research fletching if we're garrisoning archers in the TC. We still need 13 archers to fire the maximum number of arrows, but since the increase to the building attack is offset by the increase to the archer attack, it's strictly a benefit to get the extra 1 damage per TC arrow. And one more thing, while the Persians are well known for their douche because of their double TC hit points, the Teutons also have a bonus for douching. Their plus 10 garrison capacity for the TC also increases the maximum number of arrows it fires by plus 5. That's a potential of an extra 25 damage per volley in the Dark Age, or 30 damage with fletching. But if the doucher advances to the Feudal Age, then their TC gets 1 more pierce armor. This armor negates the advantage that fletching had been giving, hence fletching again becomes a strict downgrade to the TC. And without fletching, there's no advantage to going to Feudal, since the pierce component of the attack already is 0, so the extra armor doesn't help. Next, remember that secondary arrows don't have hill bonuses. If a castle is on a hill, then it doesn't get as much of an attack bonus as we might think, since only one of its arrows gets the 25% increase. Now don't get me wrong, it's still very important to keep castles on top of hills so they take less damage from enemy trebuchets. The elevation just isn't a huge increase to their damage output. It's also important to keep attack bonuses in mind. Units in building projectiles have different bonus damages. Here's a castle filled with Mangudai. It fires 21 arrows per volley, but it still isn't very effective at destroying rams. Even though the Mangudai have an attack bonus against siege, this bonus doesn't apply to the garrison arrows. We have to ungarrison the Mangudai for them to use their bonus and destroy the rams. On the other hand, castle arrows have bonus damage against ships. If our castle is on the coast, then we can increase our damage output by keeping the Mangudai garrisoned. That makes the castle fire more secondary arrows with the attack bonus. And in the Feudal Age, we often use towers to break through walls. Walls have 5 pierce armor, so even with fletching, all tower arrows deal only 1 attack. Unless the tower both has fletching and is on a hill, then the primary arrow does 1.25 attack. Since villagers have an attack bonus against walls, it's faster to break through a palisade by attacking with villagers than it is by garrisoning them and shooting from the tower. Of course, the villagers should be garrisoned to provide extra firepower if they can't all fit to attack the wall, or if there are enemy archers on the other side that can hit them. Now with those examples out of the way, here's one last trick. When a building is shooting a stream of projectiles, then we can right-click in the middle of the attack in order to switch targets. The remaining projectiles now aim at the new target. This trick can help to prevent overkill, where more arrows than necessary fly towards a unit who already is doomed to die. But it does seem to be a bit buggy. Sometimes changing targets makes the building stop firing and start reloading. I'm not sure what causes this to happen, and I haven't found a consistent way to cause or to prevent it, but it's easy enough to reproduce with a garrison castle that fires at a bunch of targets. The same thing happens in the original game too, so just be aware of this if you try switching targets. Maybe it's something that can be fixed in the future. And that's just about it. The building projectile system isn't very straightforward, particularly since upgrading the attack can decrease the number of arrows fired. It's important to keep this quirk in mind when playing, since there are situations where it actually does matter. In particular, Be careful about researching blacksmith upgrades when you're relying on garrisoned villagers, because doing so will decrease the number of arrows the buildings fire. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.